Now, without further ado, I invite Professor Malhotra to deliver the fourth annual Endowment Lecture 2022 of the Prajna Foundation.
Thank you so much, Anita, for that introduction. And of course, I'm really, really grateful to the foundation, as also to the Department of English at Sacred Heart College. I'm very, very fond of the college, and I was just seeing the image of the college, and I was remembering all the, my visits to the college. And I'm really grateful to the department and to the foundation for thinking of me and inviting me, particularly to Johnson, a dear, dear old friend of mine. So it's such a pleasure and privilege and honor for me to be here. I'm grateful to all the members of the foundation, as also to all the office bearers of the university, including the principal, the vice principal, and everybody who's taken out time, and all the people. There are 94 people. I can't believe it. So many people who joined, really, but so kind of you to actually give your time for this talk. I hope I can do justice to your presence here. So when Johnson asked me what I should speak on, or what I could speak on, and he gave me absolute freedom, really, I thought that what is it that I could talk about? And since this is something that I've been engaging in for some time in terms of, theorizing primarily how we look at how feminism itself has evolved in departments of English under the rubric of what we call post-colonial. Yeah, sorry, I got muted somehow. Yeah, right. Yeah, so so just to get back to what I was saying, which is that in the departments of English primarily, there's a particular rubric of feminism which is considered quite commonsensical now, which is the idea of post-colonial feminism. And so I thought that what are the ways in which one can look at, a particular hermeneutic lens, a particular methodology, a particular approach through which we look at issues of gender from this rubric of post-colonial feminism, and how this can probably be thought of from another lens, which is from the lens of women's movement in India. So I thought that's what I will try to trace in my presentation or my talk today. And so what I'm attempting to do in this presentation of mine is to primarily offer a critique of post-colonial feminist hermeneutics. So for doing that, I will of course lay before you what are the presumptions of this post-colonial feminist hermeneutics or feminist thinking, and how probably there is a need for us to supplement, this theoretical model or this theoretical formulation, primarily by taking into account real feminist movements in India, so that we can make this particular theoretical premise more responsive to ground realities of how feminism may have evolved through women's movement itself, and not just through theories of feminism only. And so that is what my attempt on my project in today's talk is. So let me just begin, which is with the presumption, which is that the presumption, of course, in departments of English for a fairly long time has been that we've been essentially governed by a post-colonial feminist hermeneutics, a post-colonial feminist way of looking at things, which makes us think about all kinds of social, cultural, literary processes from a post-colonial critical lens. And of course, that's only natural. Post-colonialism has been one of the most important levers which has diversified the field of English studies, especially considering our own past and our own history of colonial rule, and also how therefore we have curricularly, as also in the engagements, the theoretical engagements, as also the practical engagements of how we've diversified our curricula by looking at, in writings in English or in literatures. That has become almost the mainstay of how we look at literary studies within our own departments and in our own practices, so to say. But as I argue, which is that probably there's also a need for us to rethink this predominant signifier of the post-colonial hermeneutics or post-colonial feminist hermeneutics, under which everything is of course thought, and instead probably there's also a need for us to make possible a dialogue which one can have between this theoretical premise and the more indigenous socio-cultural musing or practices or experiences that women would have or would have in our own context in some senses. And so And so therefore, what probably one needs to do is to marry off the theory and practice with each other on the one hand, and think of feminism not just as a theoretical domain, but also as a practical domain in terms of something that it also emerges from women's movements in India, and not just as something which is a received tradition, especially in departments of English, since we do have a long history, right, from Stonecraft to Virginia Woolf to Simone de Beauvoir. I mean, one can just keep on listing Leo Sirigara and Kristeva, so many theoreticians that kind of inform feminism for us. And so therefore, in this particular talk, I will of course engage with the context of feminism in our own situatedness as departments of English, and also look at women's movement in India. Now, when we talk about the post-colonial rubric under which feminism has been thought of curricularly, and of course, there are certain features that one needs to keep in mind when one talks about that, we need to, of course, define for ourselves what is it that I'm invoking when I'm talking about post-colonial feminist hermeneutics. I must at least lay before you all what is my presumption behind this, if indeed, of course, this is a category which exists, but and how I'm trying to problematize this particular category itself, primarily from the point of view of looking at women's movement in India and from more indigenous socio-cultural practices. So let me first lay before you what are the presumptions, or what are the features, if one can call it that, of what I call post-colonial feminist poetics or practice, or hermeneutics or method, so to say. The first feature, of course, as one can see, is that that as opposed to a certain universal, a certain kind of a globally received tradition of feminism, which was dominated, as we all know, from a certain North-centric or a certain West-centric perspective, and which kind of course, influenced a lot of ways in which we thought of women's issues, so to say. That has kind of informed our reading formation for a fairly long time. And post-colonial feminism, of course, tried to fracture this received tradition of feminist understanding from the global North or from the global West by putting in the lever of the post-colonial, and so therefore would go on to make this particular received paradigm responsive to our own indigenous locations, our own indigenous reality, our own indigenous experiences in that sense. And so, of course, whether it is so even though it's a resistance movement, the resistance movement itself has been resisted from a post-colonial perspective, because the post-colonial perspective itself has questioned this universalist, globalist, essentialist kind of a understanding of feminism. And that is something that has, of course, has had huge gains for us in terms of how we've looked at the issue of feminism in our own, locations, in our own spaces. For instance, things like dowry, or for instance, things like, certain issues of caste, which might be very, very central to our own realities, may not be something which may be significant for other contexts, so to say. So, of course, post-colonial feminism has certainly made a certain global, a certain kind of a universal, idea of feminism. It has got fractured. Then post-colonially, of course, there are the world over, whether it's from different contexts, Latin America or Africa or Chicken or Latina, etc., etc. There's also a certain kind of an Indian response, or a certain, Indian within quotes, of course, but a certain kind of a response which emerges from our own context. So that's, of course, the first thing that I wanted to highlight, which is that as opposed to a received tradition of feminism under the post-colonial legacy, of course, one questions this received tradition. Because our curricula, of course, has responded to it in some senses, and we have, of course, examined the assumptions of such a feminism from our own locations, and that's, of course, a good thing. That is, of course, something which has been a gain for us. But this is one particular aspect. But the second engagement, let's say, the post-colonial feminist hermeneutics has kind of given us is that even when one starts talking about local feminism or feminism which emerges from our own socio-cultural and indigenous locations, so to say, oftentimes because of post-colonial hermeneutics' own engagement with the colonial moment or with the colonial history as a paradigm, moment, so to say, or as a defining moment with which it engages. And of course, we understand that post-colonial can only engage with what is the colonial. And so therefore, of course, there is a certain kind of rubric under which it functions. There's a framework under which it functions. So of course, a lot of energy within post-colonial feminism is devoted primarily to engaging with that colonial history, with that colonial past, with that colonial moment. And even when one talks about local feminism, often we see that within the post-colonial rubric of feminism, it gets tied to this colonial epoch. And of course, within that, post-colonial feminism has tried to look at some of the gains which have been made by the colonial state itself. And there's no denying the fact that that the colonial enterprise did try to address a number of issues which were deeply problematic about our own socio-cultural reality. And so a number of misogynistic practices that would have existed in our own societies, whether it is sati, whether it is widow remarriage, whether it is all kinds of other regressive practices, which I don't need to really enlist before this audience, but we know that there were so many misogynistic practices which were there, and colonial state did play a role in kind of ameliorating or trying to redress some of the problems through the promulgation of laws, through certain practices which they try to engineer, through the state machinery, etc., etc. So of course there are certain kind of gains which have been made by the intervention of the colonial state in some senses. So post-colonial engagement with the colonial movement is not without its gains. Of course, there are certain gains which have been made. However, even when one looks at post-colonial feminist hermeneutics engagement with this colonial epoch, it is largely driven by looking at the point of view of how administratively or through the promulgation of law, or how as a colonial administration, the colonial state would have intervened in, let's say, getting rid of the misogynistic practices which would have existed at that point of time. And a lot of credit, let's say, for this is given to, therefore, to the colonial administrative rule itself, which kind of redeems, the colonial state in some senses. I mean, which of course is not the case. I mean, we know that's of course not the case, but in some ways, by making the colonial administrative rule as something which was, of course, party to alleviating certain misogynistic practices, one does redeem the colonial state, and one does say that, look, it did deliver certain goods to us, and which is not to deny the fact that it did not. Of course, it did play a significant role, but even within the post-colonial feminist hermeneutic, apart from crediting the colonial state as something which was responsible for alleviating the lives of women, even when we talk about, let's say, within the colonial period or colonial epoch, certain reformist movements which were there, whether it's to do with women's education or it's to do with certain other, reform movements which were part of this particular time. And one can think of so many names in this particular context, whether it's Raja Ram Mohan Roy, whether it's Vidyasagar, etc., etc. All of these people, of course, did play a significant role in, enabling women's empowerment in some senses. But ultimately, if you really look at this particular engagement of feminist, post-colonial feminist hermeneutic with the colonial epoch, colonial movement, it does end up giving credit for a lot of things which happened during the colonial period, either to the colonial administration or to indigenous male reformers. I mean, it's almost as if women are absent from this particular discourse. So it's men who get credited, whether it's men, liberal men who are part of the colonial administration, or even, let's say, for example, when we talk about social reforms movement, within that also it's always men who get talked about, whether it's Vidyasagar or Ram Mohan Roy. Please note that, I mean, it's not to take away the credit of these movements, but it's also to place before you a certain kind of narrative which is kind of also persisted, and which also probably form a certain dialogue that I feel that we should have with this history, needs to take into account certain other things as well. So this is, of course, no doubt that there were male indigenous reformers. There was the role that the colonial state played in alleviating the state of women and the status of women during the colonial period. But essentially, what it does end up doing is primarily to credit men as the ones who spearheaded women's movement or spearheaded women's empowerment during the colonial period. So this is the second aspect that I also wanted to highlight before you all. The third thing that I want to talk about it, that even when we move away from, let's say, reform which was started either by colonial administration or social reforms which were promulgated against misogynistic practices by, let's say, indigenous male reformers, even when one moves away from this and one moves away from, let's say, crediting men as essentially the ones who were responsible for bringing about gender justice during the colonial period, And we move to, let's say, another moment, which is also very important and which is exactly what I intend to spend more time on, which is, when we talk about the anti-colonial struggle and we talk about the phase of nationalist movement, and we talk about the narrative of women's participation in the nationalist movement, and we do talk about all kinds of women who did participate in the nationalist movement, whether it's Sarojini Naidu, etc., etc., and these are all syllabized poets, etc., in our curricula in some ways, and we pay homage to them, and rightly so to say. But ultimately, what we end up seeing also within this particular paradigm is that women, even when women do get talked about during this particular phase, which is the nationalist phase, the anti-colonial struggle phase, so to say, women willy-nilly do get inserted into the narrative as something which is as people who are part of the nationalist framework, or as people who are part of the narrative of freedom struggle, of the building of the nation in some senses. And there's no going away from this large narrative of the nation in which women finally do find a space for themselves as part of the freedom struggle or as part of anti-colonial struggle. And this is where we place women. And of course, there are exemplary women that we do talk about during this particular phase. So even when we move away from the scope of British colonial-driven social reform or indigenous social reformers who are of indigenous or indigenous origin, so to say, women, when they do get talked about in this particular post-colonial engagement with this colonial epoch, is we ultimately see that women get co-opted into a certain nationalist framework, a certain framework of the nation, so to say, and into the rubric of the build-up of the nation in some senses. And so therefore they get placed at that particular altar. Now, these three features are what I'm going to spend some time on, because these are the presumptions through which a lot of post-colonial feminist hermeneutics kind of has built itself against a certain kind of a received global north, received tradition of feminism, which is more essential. And one has talked about local feminism. One talks about local feminism as opposed to that. But within that, we've seen that a lot of post-colonial energy is, of course, devoted to an engagement with the colonial epoch. But often we talk about, and I'm not saying that's not important, about sati and women's and dowry, and widow remarriage and things like that. Or even the role that, let's say, social reformers would have played, so to say. Or we talk about women's insertion primarily into the anti-colonial nationalist struggle. But this is the rubric that we have largely before us. And of course, curricularly, we have responded to this particular engagement through the post-colonial feminist engagement in some senses. But what is it that is entailed in this presumption, or in this presumption which kind of defines what I'm calling the post-colonial feminist standpoint, so to say? Of course, a very important gain which has been made is that there is a certain kind of a space which has been created for local feminism, and that is, of course, very, very significant and important. But when we talk about local women's issues, so to say, whether these are specific, of course, to the Indian context of sati or widow remarriage or dowry, etc., they primarily get married to this particular idea of colonial administration, and so men primarily get credited with social reform, so to say. And the third thing, of course, is that even when we uncouple women's movement from this colonial administrator-driven or the social reform, male social reforms-driven idea of women's empowerment, they get subsumed within the grand narrative of the nation, or the nationalist anti-colonial freedom struggle, so to say. And of course, I need not really talk about, because this has been theorized as we know, that this has been, of course, theorized in many, many works of how, the idea of India is mapped onto the idea of Bharat Mata, and how, there's a feminization of the whole idea of the nation, etc., etc. So there are, of course, very, very problematic aspects, but I'm not going to spend time on that. There's a lot of energy which has been devoted on that in popular and also academic works which have been done on this problem of mapping the nation onto the category of gender, or nation onto the category of this figure of the Bharat Mata itself in some senses. Now, if ultimately, like I said, that we have to question this premise or deal with this premise, which kind of defines post-colonial feminist hermeneutics for us, and essentially, like I said, that one has to have a dialogue with women's movement as it has existed in India, and also marry off a theoretical understanding of post-colonialism with the practices of feminism in India, then probably there are of course, things that one needs to also put on the table, and that is what I will do in my presentation. While the first point is taken, which is that the most important gain of post-colonial feminism has been talk about local feminism, and that is something that I will talk about in the rest of my talk. But what we also need to show, and that is what I will try to show and demonstrate in my presentation, that not all women's movement battling traditional misogynist practices, especially during the colonial epoch, were spearheaded only by colonial administrator reformers or by indigenous male reformers. Instead, they were, during the colonial period itself, a number of women's movements, a number of women's grassroots movements during the colonial times, which was spearheaded not by men, but primarily by women. And of course, since I'm speaking at Sacred Heart College itself, I'm sure all of you are aware of the Chennaur revolt of the 19th century itself. So we are aware of how within our own context, there have been a lot of women's movement which were not, administratively spearheaded only by colonial administrators, or only by, social reformers, which were primarily men. But there are robust women's movement which exist during this colonial period itself, which were primarily spearheaded by women themselves, and these were women's movement in themselves. So this is something that I will talk about. And of course, since one cannot really enlist all the movements during the colonial period, but I will talk about at least two movements. One is, of course, from our own context, which is to talk about the Chennaur revolt, and the other is, of course, to talk about a particular revolt which also happened during pre-independence, which is the Nupilan movement of Manipur. So these are two movements that I will talk about, which also must therefore inform our own understanding of how we can look at, from a post-colonial feminist hermeneutics, the colonial period, but one need not only look at male social reformers or colonial state induced and engineered and driven, reforms or movements of which were brought about. The third thing that I will also point out here is that within the context of the notion of the establishment of the post-colonial nation state and the post-colonial Indian state, so to say, the nation, of course, has not really delivered all freedoms to women. I think that's something that one need not really state or even overstate or underscore or highlight. This is something which is fairly well known to us, and we know that there are so many fissures which exist as far as women within the post-colonial state are concerned, and they are still trying very, very hard to win freedoms in their own locations in some senses. And so what I will also attempt to do is to also look at how within the formation of the nation state, there are ways of conceiving the nation or ways of imagining the nation or rethinking the nation or forming the nation, which is not necessarily only driven by a certain anti-colonial nationalist, anti-colonial freedom struggle, nationalist-oriented discourse only, where we put a lot of stress and where we put a lot of energy. But there are also ways of imagining the nation which have come from women's movement, which is a completely different imagination, and which will probably also tell us about how we can move away from the narrative of, let's say, the nation and the Bharat Mata. Sure, Sid. So thank you for the response. Yeah, but not necessarily, the Bharat Mata, but also to look at, how women themselves imagine the nation, how women themselves think of the nation or conceive of the nation in some senses. So just to present before you what I've said so far, theoretically, the paradigm that I'm building towards you, which is that the common sense of how we look at feminism in English departments is through the post-colonial lens. And of course, because of the post-colonial lens, there are a huge number of gains which we have made, which is, of course, that we've started to pay attention not to some universal ideas of feminism, but to also look at local feminism and to look at post-colonial feminism. But since post-colonial feminism is largely tied to the colonial epoch, a lot of our engagement is with the colonial epoch, and within that, when we go on to look at, let's say, what we may consider women's movement, which may have emanated from the colonial period, we give a lot of credit to the state or the colonial administrative state having delivered a lot of freedoms to women, which is true, and also to a lot of male social reformers who would have also participated in actually giving or granting freedoms to women, which is also true, but that is only part of the narrative. That narrative also needs to be supplemented by looking at the colonial moment or the colonial epoch or the colonial period, by looking at women's such movements which were primarily engineered by women, where women were the agents, women were the ones who spearheaded these movements, and these were not necessarily only driven by men or by male social reformers or by the colonial state itself. So they are non-state actors, and primarily women who themselves were also agents for social change and participated in also making the state responsive to their issues. So that's the second aspect. And the third aspect, of course, is that a lot of post-colonial feminism, since it is interested in the formation of the post-colonial nation state, goes on to map the category of gender onto the category of the nation itself. And so there's a particular imagination which has become the mainstay of how we look at the nation itself. However, if you look at women's movement from other parts of India, there are other imaginings of the nation which also come from women's movement, which may also give us a window into how women themselves have thought of the nation, and not necessarily as something which is only from a certain perspective, which has so far defined our ways of looking at women's relationship with the nation. So this is what I've said so far. And so therefore, I will spend some time in trying to now detail out what I have promised to do. So the first point, which is local feminism, is, I think, granted. And whatever I'm going to talk about is obviously going to be talking about local feminism. So that's not something that I'm going to spend any energy on, but I'll spend some energy on the two supplementation that I'm saying that we need to have to be able to also look at post-colonial feminism and to make it responsive to women's movement in India. And that's what I'll spend some time on. Which is that one cannot, and so therefore one cannot simply look at women as complicit in a certain national project alone, and instead how one needs to look at how within the scope of the nation itself, from their own locations, women were also questioning a certain unified, homogeneous idea of the nation itself. So this is also something that I will talk about. But I'll first talk about the second point, which is that how they were grassroots women's movement during the colonial period, which were primarily driven by women themselves. And something that I don't need to spend too much time on is on Channar Revolt, because I'm hoping that all of you would be aware of the Channar Revolt. But as I'm sure all of you know, that the struggle by women in mid-19th century, and roughly the dates are from 1813 to 1859. We are talking about the mid-19th century, so to say. We are aware of the fact that there was this major revolt, which is the Channar Revolt, which was, of course, there in the state of Travancore. But primarily, as I'm sure all of you know the history, which is that women who primarily belonged to the Nadar community in the Travancore kingdom were primarily making an argument against a certain kind of practice which did not allow them to cover their breasts, and so therefore they were the upper cloth movement, which is also called the upper cloth movement, which is that they were making a case for how they must be allowed to cover themselves, because as we know that because of the caste hierarchical practices, they could not have covered their breasts in front of women who were primarily of upper caste, so the Nair women, so to say, and so therefore. Therefore, of course, we know that there's a strong divisive Hindu casteist community and Hindu casteist practices which were there during the colonial time itself. And so only the upper caste women could cover their breasts, so to say, and the lower class women were barred from wearing the upper caste. Of course, it's a long history where they converted to Christianity, and then, I'm not really going to go into the whole history of what all they did to be able to somehow bypass and to earn this right for being able to cover their breasts. But we know that from 1813, there was a concerted movement by women, and especially women who belong to the Nadar community, against a certain kind of a practice which was supported by a certain divisive casteist practice, which did not allow them to actually cover their breasts. They made concerted, and it was a concerted and a long-lasting movement. It's one of the longest movements that we see, where they fought for their right to be able to cover their breast, and this went on until 1859. So 1813 to 1859 is a fairly prolonged period. However, of course, when we look at the colonial epoch, and even when post-colonial feminism engages with the colonial epoch, while we do pay homage to a lot of other things which happened during this particular period, but oftentimes this particular history also gets elided in that particular discourse, which is that a lot of movement, a lot of gains were made locally against indigenous practices which were problematic, which were misogynistic in themselves, but which were primarily initiated and which were primarily led by women themselves and not necessarily by men. But I'm not really going to spend too much time, because obviously I'm sure these histories can be read by everybody, but I wanted to signpost this for the case that I'm trying to make. And the second case that I want to also talk about is from the state of Manipur. I'm not very sure whether you all are aware of this particular movement, which is called the Nupilan. Nupilan. So oftentimes we talk about Nupilan, the first Nupilan movement or the second Nupilan movement in Manipur, but these are very, very significant and important movements. The first movement is in the year 1904. So of course, we're talking about the colonial period, we're talking about the colonial epoch, where the women of Manipur went on to protest against a certain British practice and British political agents primarily, who were, of course, and they were primarily talking about two issues, and this is very, very significant, which is that, I mean, I don't really have the time to go into the whole history, but there was a particular administrative practice, which is that for the 40 days that you worked, you would work 10 days for free, and so there was a forced labor, and primarily for men. So these are women who are also making a case for labor practices for men and not just for women in that sense. But there was, of course, an immediate let's say trigger at that point of time, which is that men were being sent to the Cabo Valley to fetch timber for a police agent's house which had got burnt, etc., etc. So I'm not really going to go into that, but primarily in 1904, as far as the women in Manipur are concerned, they started off a movement which is referred to as the Nupilan, and which is called Women's War or whatever, but against the British political agents, and not just about the issue of labor or labor laws or labor practices, so to say, that were deeply problematic and deeply exploited in that sense, but also about the taking away of timber, of taking away of timber for building this particular house for the police agent in that sense. Of course, much later we do talk about the Chipko movement, but already we can see that in 1904 there's already a women's movement which is actually driven by a certain concern for ecology, a certain concern for saving timber, so to say, but also not just only about that, but also about primarily exploitation of labor. And this particular movement was such a, so of course there was a whole, there was a whole state of machinery which was kind of launched against these women. But ultimately the gain of the movement was that the British order was rescinded. So the British government had to rescind its order because of the women's movement, and which of course had a long-lasting impact on much later to political reform, to administrative reforms, etc., etc. And I will talk about that in a moment. But this particular movement of 1904, which was primarily led by women in the state of Manipur, against, of course, a local trigger at that point of time, but also against certain administrative policies which were deeply exploitative of labor practices, was something which was primarily spearheaded by women and women only. So this is, of course, referred to as the first Nupilan movement. And again, in 1933, and this is from 1933 to 1935, that is the period which is referred to as the second Nupilan movement, which was against, and this is very interesting, that this particular movement is not just against the colonial state or the political agents of the state or the British political agents, so to say, but also against the intermediaries, the comprador class of the Marwari traders who were present in the state of Manipur at that point of time, because these traders, the Marwari traders, primarily in complicity with the British administrators, were exporting rice from Manipur. And they had, in fact, engineered a whole famine in Manipur at that point of time, which was during the harvest season. Now, of course, this is a famous signpost in the history of Manipur, so to say. But again, this particular movement against not just the Marwari traders and their exploitation and their exploitative trade of exporting rice and causing engineering a famine in the state of Manipur during the harvest season, but also against a certain kind of a complicity that the Marwari traders had with the British political agents, Again, this particular movement was launched by the women, and a lot of women in Manipur lost their lives, in fact, as part of their struggle. And we don't talk about freedom fighters, or we don't talk about, when we talk about fighters who actually fought the British administrators from certain parts, like, let's say, for example, from Manipur. But this particular movement was even more successful than the first one, because what it went on to do was to cast a long shadow on the formation of the constitution of Manipur itself. So it went on to actually lead to a number of constitutional reforms, a number of administrative reforms, which, because of this movement, was actually engineered in the state of Manipur, so to say. Now, I mean, obviously, if you're interested, you can certainly read about the Nupilan movement for yourselves if you're interested. But basically, my point was, and this is the reason why I wanted to highlight these two movements. These are two movements which are in completely different parts of India. One is in Manipur, the other is in the state of Kerala. But these are movements which are there during the colonial period against misogynistic practices which might be there, or against the colonial state itself and the agents of the colonial state itself, where women are the ones who were spearheading social reforms, political reforms, administrative reforms, constitutional reforms, and of course these grassroots movements which were there in Kerala, or in this is only just a peg really to hang the idea that I'm trying to say, which is that we need to excavate a number of these movements which were primarily spearheaded by women, and these were not only driven by men during the colonial period. And of course, what it also highlights for us is are the issues of which are related to it, which is caste issues and community issues, and practices which are indigenous to one's own society in some senses. But the reason why I wanted to highlight these two movements was to give you a flavor, which is that during the colonial period itself, women themselves were agents of change. Women themselves were the ones who brought about changes, not just for themselves, but also for the formation of the states, also for labor policies, also for policies for administration. So these are very, very significant and important movements, so to say, which often we do not talk about, and they get elided in this grand narrative or the grand history that we create in some senses. So I won't really spend too much time on this particular aspect, but instead I'll move to the third point, which is the category of the nation itself, and how of course, women were inserted into the national framework, and of course, it has its own kind of problems. But as we all know, and one does not really need to state this, but India, of course, is a vivisected, multicultural, multinational, plural collectivity. It's a synthetic category, really, in that sense, where there are, of course, divisions on all kinds of grounds of language, of region, of religion, of caste, etc., etc. And of course, feminism, even for post-colonial feminism, cannot really shy away from taking into account this particular framework of the nation itself, of the post-colonial nation itself, in some senses. And of course, probably there is a need to mainframe this particular idea rather than falling for the post-colonial allegory of the nation. So the post-colonial allegory of the nation is something which we have seen in novel after novel, in literature after literature, being lived out in some senses. But if post-colonial feminism has to be responsive to this particular burden of the nation, which a particular agenda has to wear on itself through figures like Bharat Mata, which are contentious figures and all kinds of things, then probably this allegory of the post-colonial nation also needs to be punctured by certain other movements which one needs to look at from different parts of India. And these are vibrant women's movements. And obviously, I can't really do an exhaustive study of all the movements, so to say. And so therefore, for the sake of brevity, but for the sake of being able to talk about the point that I wish to make, I will pick up 5 different movements, and these are from 5 different parts of India. So from North India, from East India, from West India, and from South India, and from Central India, to primarily talk about how within the post-colonial nation, or the imagining of the post-colonial nation, women also had their own imagination, and which is something which is reflected in how the women's movement themselves were shaping up during this formation of the nation state itself, or within the rubric of the post-colonial nation itself. So the first movement that I will talk about here is, and this is something which everybody will know, and so therefore I need not really spend too much time on it, but is the Chipko movement. The Chipko movement, I'm sure, is something which everybody here would be familiar with, which of course comes from the northern part of India, from the Garhwal Hills, as I'm sure all of you know. And of course, This was a movement which was led by men and women both, but women were very, very active participants in this movement of Chipko movement, which was against, of course, the ecological ravaging of the forest, so to say, in the name of development. In the name of development, and development is, of course, a very important narrative in the formation of the nation state, in the formation of the post-colonial nation state itself. But as opposed to this idea of development, or the idea of development, we do have this movement led by women, which is the Chipko movement, which was against the ravaging ravaging of the forest, so to say, in Uttarakhand, which of course was a movement which was a fairly robust movement, which was launched against the timber mafia. And it fought against the timber mafia and, of course, their allied forces. And from 1970s onwards, we see that what came to be known as the Chipko movement, where women started to hug trees to be able to save them from felling, so to say, in the Garhwal Hills. They primarily argued against this whole logging the felling of trees and this logging operation, so to say. And in fact, so much so that in the 1970s, especially in the early part of 1970s, 1973, 1974, Mahila Dals, women's Dals or women's groups, so to say, or women's brigade actually is the name. They were formed in every village, in every division, against official loggers and against the official timber mafia, so to say. Now, of course, post-1980s, when we talk about the movement of ecology and ecological consciousness as having taken birth, we do go back to this particular movement as talking about the ecofeminism or talking about ecofeminist movements, which was oriented, of course, against a certain kind of a developmental rhetoric, which was part of the formation of the post-colonial nation state itself. But we see that there is a completely different imagining of the nation itself. I mean, very famously, of course, at that point of time, Bahuguna had said, Sundarlal Bahuguna had said that ecology is a permanent, ecological consciousness is a permanent economics. So ecology is the permanent economics. I'm forgetting the exact quote, but I mean, basically, I mean, he was talking about local livelihood issues and how the ecology of the place is something which can sustain economics in some senses. But a certain developmental rhetoric and a developmental logic, which was part of the formation of the post-colonial nation state, is being fractured by women's movement and by women themselves in how they differently imagine the formation of the post-colonial nation state from a much more ecological consciousness as compared to a certain kind of a developmental logic. So this is, of course, the first movement that I wanted to highlight before you. The second movement that I will talk about is from the eastern part of India, and I'll again go back to Manipur, and I'm sure again you may or may not have heard of the Myra Paibis, but these are primarily, I'm sure you would have probably seen images on television sometimes when it gets flashed of women who are primarily torch bearers, and they would take to the streets of the city of Imphal, and as torch bearers they would walk and they would protest against certain violations by the state machinery itself. But they would essentially be guardians of civil society. They would be the guardians of the torchbearers of civil society. And from 1977 onward, again, we see that women with flaming torches, they would take to the city streets and they would bring into focus a number of issues, and they would take up all kinds of issues, right from arguing against selling of liquor to human rights violations to all kinds of issues that they would brought to the fore, but primarily talk about crimes against women, and also by the state, so to say. As also we know that they've been also spearheading, and we need not really take names, but spearheading the campaign against the repealing of the AFSPA, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, etc., and how and we all also are aware of this particular episode of Manorma and Manorma's death, and then the protest of women, the naked women who had marched carrying a flag in the streets of Manipur, so to say. And so we are aware of all these movements from the eastern part of India too. So this Myra Paibis, and of course since they hark back to the history of the Nopilan, they're also called the third Nopilan, so to say. But in the 1970s, we know that this particular movement, and it's a movement which is a concerted movement. It's an ongoing movement, which is a movement against violations and crime against women, which may have been engineered by state and non-state actors, and also against certain violations. And so this is a fairly robust movement which is being spearheaded by a number of women in Manipur. And so, of course, this is the second movement that I wanted to signpost before you, which is also a different kind of an imagination of the nation state, which also offers a critique of the organs of the nation state, be it the army or the police, etc., which talks about mainframing the idea of human rights within the imagining of the nation state itself, which is a different imagining, which comes from the women's movement, so to say. And so this is something that I wanted to highlight from the eastern part of India. I'll quickly move on to I've taken up a lot of time, but I'll quickly move on to the third part, which is I'll talk about the central belt of India. And again, if you look at the tribal belt of central India, whether it's Bastar or Gachibowli, etc., a certain kind of a rhetoric of development has also been questioned for decades by a number of tribal communities there, a number of tribal activists there, and against, of course, violations and the rights of the people who own the forest or people who own the land, and against, a certain kind of a collusion between corporate groups and the state in some senses. And so there's been a concerted women's movement which has been launched in the central part of India. And in fact, in Bastar and in many of these places, if you look at the enrollment of women who actually belong to these women's group, it's like 1 lakh women who are part of this movement. But often we don't really talk about these women's movements, so to say, but they are the ones who've been fighting against a certain kind of a pollution of corporate power and corporate capitalism and state power in some senses. And so therefore, and of course, they've thrown up all kinds of leaders like Soni Sori, etc., but there are a number of movements which have actually emerged from central parts of India, from tribal communities, communities who otherwise are elided in the discourse of the nation or the post-colonial nation state and its imaginings. And so these are women-led movement from such communities, which have also been trying to look at, therefore, what are the ways in which we can go on to look at the imagining of the post-colonial nation state, which can also be responsive to their own reality in some senses. But I won't spend too much time on that. And I'll quickly move on to the fourth movement that I want to talk about. And this is, of course, an interesting movement, which is in 2009. I'm sure all of you, probably since this is more proximal to your own lives in some senses, may have heard of the Pink Chaddi campaign. I don't know if you guys had heard of the Pink Chaddi campaign or not, but this was a movement which was launched in Bangalore against the so-called guardians of Indian femininity, which was and this particular group, which had kind of launched an attack against women, was led by the Sri Ram Sena, where women were beaten up for going to a pub in the city of Bangalore, and they were threatened that if they celebrate Valentine's Day, then they will be, they will be married off, etc., And there were these images which were flashed all across the television, etc., which and there was a lot of flack which was. Which this particular group, the Sri Ram Sena group, and the Ram Muthalik, who was their president, had got. And of course, as opposed to, and against this particular attack on women who were going to pubs in 2009 in Bangalore, a certain group was formed, which of course was led by famous activist Nisha Susan, but many others had joined her, of course, at that point of time, which was basically a consortium of what they call themselves, of pub-going, loose and forward women, who started the Pink Chaddi campaign. And the idea, of course, was, and this, of course, spread across media because this started off on social media. It went off, it was covered by the television, it was there in the newspapers, etc., but the idea, of course, was that there would be these pink underwears which would be sent to the Sri Ram Sena office, and they never really had imagined the kind of response that their movement got. But they were hundreds and hundreds and thousands of thousands such underwears which were sent to the Sri Ram Sena office. And of course, it got a lot of media attention. Now, of course, one must also say something here about the media attention, which is that possibly, of course, women from Bastar or women from villages in Garhwal or women from Manipur will not get the kind of coverage that, let's say, women who are city-bred or women who are in Bangalore would get. And of course, there's a certain kind of a nature of the media itself, which is much more middle-class driven than, let's say, interested in the affairs of what happens to tribal belt or what happens to, let's say, certain parts of India, like let's say the Northeast, etc., or from certain communities. So that's a point that I did want to make. But what it also what it also highlighted is another aspect, which is something which must also note at the same point of time, which is that even women who are city-bred, even women who may belong to the middle classes or to the upper middle classes, even women who are educated, so to say, they too would, under a certain kind of a regime of a imagining of a homogeneous culture of what they think Indian women should be like, or what Indian women should act like, or wear like, or talk like, etc., etc. Even these would be someone who would come under attack from certain patriarchal notions, which are there very much in our cities as well. And so even these women who may otherwise seem as privileged are not really immune to certain imaginings of what they imagine or what their imagination of the Indian nation state is. And of course, you see, this is an important watershed movement in some senses, because thereafter, we would often talk about the fact that the middle class is apathetic, cities do not really care, etc., etc. We've seen that cities became the fulcrum of a lot of women's movement, or major site in some sense for women's movement. And it's very sad that there have been occasions also for there to be movements, but that's a reality in some senses. But there have been, let's say, for example, I'm sure all of you know, after the Nirbhaya case, what is referred to as the Nirbhaya case, but the infamous rape that happened, there was a major protest which was launched in Delhi. And of course, it has its ramifications in other parts of India. But I mean, that's just one thing. But there have been so many other movements which have been led by women who are educated, who come from privileged backgrounds, etc., etc. So whether it is Pindrator movement, whether it's Take Back the Night movement, whether it's the Blank Noise movement, whether it's the Slut Walk movement, or whether it's the sanitary pad movement, etc. I mean, one can go on listing many such movements, but I'm sure all of you get the sense of what I'm trying to say, which is that so it may have got media attention because of its middle class nature, but what it also highlighted that, let's say, for example, how we have blamed the middle class for being apathetic to women's movement, they themselves were brought into the fold of women's movement in some senses and became active participants. And many of these movements, of course, were led by women in cities, in urban centers, which too are sites of such practices which would have a certain imagining of what women should act like, or wear like, or eat like, or be like, or behave like in the imagining of their idea of the nation state. And of course, women's movement would go on to question this imagination of the nation state itself. And I'll quickly come to the last bit, and I promise this is really the last bit, which is the fifth example that I want to cite. And this is something that I want to take up from the western part of India. And which is primarily a practice, and this is a movement which primarily was spearheaded within the Dawoodi Bohra community by women themselves. And of course, how women from within the Dawoodi Bohra community launched a campaign against what was considered, and what is certainly a deeply problematic practice of female genital mutilation, or what is often referred to in common parlance as khatna, So of course, against female genital mutilation, for the past many years, there are a lot of Dawoodi Bohra women who've been coming out. And of course, we know names like Masuma Ranalve and many others who've been speaking about the trauma of circumcision, and who've been pledging. And this is a pledge that they've been asking mothers to take, that they will not let their daughters be circumscribed and their genitals be mutilated, so to say. But this is again an example of another movement which, under a certain patriarchal understanding, within the fold of what one's own imagination of women's insertion into such a nation state might be, women themselves are spearheading movements and are agents of social change within their own communities, within their own religions, within their own societies, and they are engineers of imagining a different kind of a imagination of a post-colonial nation. Now, these are, of course, 5 cases that I picked up, but this is basically a symptom. I mean, this is basically to talk about a symptomatic reading that we need to make of these cases, which is that from the 1970s onwards, if you look at different parts of India and different communities in India, different movements, local movements, which have been sprouting all over the nation in some senses, A certain post-colonial common sense, which has kind of informed our understanding of how we must think of feminism, has also been fractured by a lot of women's movement and the questions that they have thrown before us, and that needs to be taken into account when we think of post-colonial feminist hermeneutics. And these grassroots movements, of course, need to be mainframed to take up difficult questions of hierarchies which are perpetrated in the name of nation, in the name of religion, in the name of communities, in the name of caste, etc., which cannot subordinate women's lived experiences, including resistance, including their own resistance and the narrative of their own resistance to a paradigm which has kind of informed us. So with that, I will stop, but thank you so much for hearing me out. But I hope the talk made some sense. But if there are any questions, I'll really be happy to take any. And if there are any comments or observations, I'll be happy to listen to that as well. Thank you so much for your patience. I'm really grateful to all of you for your patience for listening to me. And it's been a privilege for me to speak to you all. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for that very, very insightful inquiry into the post-colonial feminist hermeneutics. I think, well, I didn't know that there was such a history behind movements that came from the grassroots, from the women themselves, because we tend to see women as always being uplifted by men, with the aid of men, with the aid of state machinery. So I especially noted how you tried to create a sort of unbroken tradition from the pre-colonial times of 1904 to up to 2009, and I'm guessing it still continues. That was something I learned from your session. So I think we can take questions now. If you have questions, if you put them in the chat box, I can ask them to Professor Malhotra, or if you wish to speak directly, you may do so if you raise your hand. Okay, shall I read out the questions for you? Just before that, I'll just mention that the feedback links will be, the link to the feedback form will be posted here in the chat box. Please fill that out for the purpose of getting your certificates. So the first question is from Varsha R. Menon, and she asks, how do you think feminisms of various nationalities are shaped by religion and other community-oriented groups? You want to take it? You're on mute. Still on mute, I'm afraid. Oh, Simon, sir, can you?
Yes, now it's, yeah. So there's a message which flashed that I could not unmute myself. Yeah, right. So thank you so much for that question. I can see the question by Varsha, that do you think feminisms of various nationalities are shaped by religion and other community-oriented groups? Yeah, Varsha, I'm so glad that you asked that question. It's a good question. And this is exactly the point that I was trying to make, that as far as India is concerned, India is a fairly synthetic category. I mean, there's nothing called Indian language or Indian religion or Indian community. I mean, of course, it's a synthetic, kind of a conglomeration where there are a number of communities of different religion, of different castes, of different, sub-nationalities, if you want to call it, exist. And so, of course, the issues before, let's say, women in Kerala will not be the same as issues before, for example, matrilineal societies in let's say, for example, in Shillong, so of course there's no doubt about the fact that our religion, our communities, our practices within that are shaped by are shaped not by this, synthetic category of the nation in some senses, but the immediacy of the lived realities that we have in our own communities. And this is exactly what I wanted to highlight, which is that lest we forget in the large narrative of the nation, that how the nation is also shaped by, let's say, Channar revolt or by the Nupilan movement, which may or may not, I mean, of course, it did have an impact, let's say, in administrative reform, in constitutional reforms, in reforming societies, etc., etc. But at the same time, I mean, it is these women-driven movements which need to be looked at and pay close attention to if one has to rewrite the history of even the post-colonial engagement with the colonial epoch, because one can't not look at how within the colonial epoch women were shaping their own narrative, or they were shaping their own kind of fates through the kind of concerted movement that they themselves launched in some senses. And so more people-driven narratives also need to be brought into focus here, and that is precisely what I was trying to make a case for. I hope I have answered that. Just like I gave the example of the Dawoodi Bohra community and how this concerted effort by women from within their own communities fighting the patriarchy within their own religious formation is something which is trying to shape or is going to shape the future of the community itself in some senses, and how gender justice can be achieved precisely by these kind of narratives and these kind of voices. And that is precisely what I was trying to highlight. Should I read the question myself, Anita? Because I can see the next question by Aishwarya. Should I do that?
If you would like to.
Yes, yeah. So Aishwarya said, do you think transnational feminism is a more evolved and advanced feminist human hermeneutics than post-colonial feminism? It's an excellent question, Aishwarya. I mean, that's a fantastic question. And I think there's no competitive feminism really in that sense that one feminism is better than the other. I think already the feminist narrative is so fractured in some senses that everybody's shy of even claiming to be a feminist. I mean, everybody wants to define what kind of feminist they are, and I'm not this kind or that kind or whatever kind, etc., etc. And that's, of course, never really good for feminism or never really good for women's movement in that sense. And this is a point that I often make, which is that if feminism was to have delivered as a theoretical paradigm, the idea of gender justice through the different waves that we talk about, the first wave, second wave, third wave, fourth wave, post-feminism, standpoint feminism, this feminism, cyber-feminism, all kinds of feminism that we talk about, we would not have had, let's say, the Me Too movement actually emanating from universities itself. It tells us that we've not been able to even achieve gender justice in our own universities, in our own classrooms, in our own, privileged location that we belong to. So, of course, I would... this is a point that I'm really making, from the occasion of your question, which is that there should be no competitive feminism in that sense, which is that one feminism is better than the other. Obviously, all feminisms have different goals, so to say, before them. And transnational feminism, of course, hopes to be able to go beyond the category of the nation, just like post-colonial feminism is also trying to look at the nation and the imagining of a nation from a completely different perspective. But transnational feminism also hopes to be able to actually build solidarities with feminism outside the fold of the nation, because rather than getting hemmed into insular categories of the nation or of one's community, it is possible to have solidarities with people who are not of one's own community, of one's own religion, of one's own nationality, and one can still have transnational solidarities, affinities, like politics, etc., which need not necessarily be built only around certain kind of categories which are supported, let's say, even by post-colonial feminism, or imaginings which are more insular or more parochial or more driven by questions of identity or identity politics in that sense. So there are gains to be made by both, but like I said, that there need not be any kind of an idea of competitive feminism really in that sense. But it's an excellent question, Aishwarya. So right. Yeah, I can't see any more questions. I can only see that answer. Yeah.
If I may ask a question that sort of follows from what you just said from the answer, is there does the privilege gap between the rural and the urban that you mentioned create two different kinds of post-colonial feminist hermeneutics? So you have women in the urban side who are active on social media, worried about very different kinds of issues, and you have women in the rural side, the tribal women, worried about very different kinds of issues. So doesn't it create a solidarity gap between the feminists themselves, between women who identify as Indian post-colonial feminists? What do you think about that?
Anita, that's an excellent question. I mean, of course, it's a hard question, but it's a question that we must address. For ourselves, there's absolutely no doubt about the fact, and this is not just to do with feminism. This is to do with all kinds of discourses. I mean, ultimately, we, those who are cocooned in university spaces, in privileged departments like English, and of course, I'm not saying that we aren't making a difference in terms of what we are doing, in terms of the curricula and the energies that we devote to the intellectual engagements that we have in our departments, or even on social media, right? Just only curricularly or in the universities, but outside also in all the spaces that we may occupy and the debates that we may engage in. But at the same point of time, I mean, there is no doubt about the fact that there is still, so much of illusion of so much of discourse, and there's so much of absent narratives which are still very much a blind spot for us also as academics, I mean, and that's exactly why I was saying that we need to take into account them. And these are not my inventions. I mean, Channa Revolt and Nupilan movements are real movements of women's movement in India in some senses, but oftentimes we ourselves do not inform ourselves of our own histories of, and there's a received, kind of a tradition, and we go by that. So one is, of course, our own, commitment to informing ourselves of all the elided and all the forgotten and all this, submerged kind of narratives which actually exist, which need to be brought out and talked about in some senses. I mean, it's such a sad thing that Channa Revolt was part of the CBSE syllabus, and in 2017 it was decided that we should not teach it anymore. Which also tells us about, that how look at people who themselves are in positions of privilege, and what are the ways in which they are thinking about the imagination of what must be taught and what must not be taught in some senses. But certainly no doubt about the fact that there is a huge gap. But the point is that we do also have examples of a number of people who will, put themselves on the line, and who will go to, let's say tribal areas and tribal zones, and will draw a lot of flack. And I can take the names of so many feminists who've actually done that, and who, some of them are my friends and colleagues who have had FIRs lodged against them, for actually building solidarities with women who belong to the tribal belt, etc., and doing the hard work. So there are of course those examples of people who would stay insular in their own little cocoon worlds, and there are those who will bear the burden of what an intellectual must do, which is to be able to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. And so therefore they would speak on behalf of others too, and not just for themselves. So there are those kind of examples too, and I hope that there are more cases of such kind, where rather than only speaking for ourselves, we speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. So so I think right. So there is, I think there's a question by Sid. He sent me a direct message. Yeah. All right, I'll respond to him. There's a comment, I think, by Shirley. In fact, women are on the lookout for injustice to humanity, nature, and so on, which is remarkable. Yes, right.
Are there any more questions? You can type them in. I think that's probably it with the questions. Matilda, are you here? Matilda?
Yes, ma'am, I'm here.
Yeah, I'll welcome back Matilda to continue.
Actually, I was going to ask Pam. So it could be stated that in the backdrop of the post-colonial state of India, it helped a lot in shaping the feminist movement, as in women addressing their own issues in the backdrop of the post-colonial movement. It could be stated like that, right, ma'am?
Yeah, Matilda, yes, of course. I mean, you see, why just the post-colonial? In fact, I would say that, even though, from a certain standpoint, we do reject a lot of discourses of feminism which come from the West, or and from the North, and we say that look, we must be able to talk about our own reality and our own experience, but we also know that a lot of feminist consciousness, also has come because of us, of our engagement with the West, because of our engagement with with feminism, which has actually come from the North. Just like post-colonial feminism has certainly given a certain kind of a space to a certain inclusion of local feminism, no doubt about it. But you know, I'm not someone who belongs to that school of thought which thinks that anything that comes from the West is bad, you know, because a lot of liberal ideas that we have in our own societies, you know, have actually come from the West and actually benefited us. So, you know, rather than being closed-minded about these categories of North and South and, you know, East and West, you know, one needs to be able to see that what is it that informs our own and, you know, makes our own societies better societies in some sense.
Thank you so much for your enlightening words.
Sorry, Matilda, may I just cut in? I just got a question via message from Ms. Shweta Srikumar. So she asks, what implications do you think a Hindutva nationalist agenda might have for the tradition of female resistance in India you've outlined?
Right. Yeah, that's an excellent question. In fact, I was thinking probably a question like this will come. Of course, there's no doubt about the fact, you know, that there is a certain kind of an imagination of a nation which is now being presented to us by the ruling, you know, by the ruling dispensation in some senses, and they do have an idea of, and they have a fairly clear idea of what that imagination is. But the point really is, and this is something which one can see historically, you know, I mean, which is that, for instance, a certain idea of a caste hierarchy, you know, which was considered absolutely sacrosanct and could not be questioned, you know, that is being questioned by women themselves. And Channa Revolt is just an example of that. There are so many others as well, you know, which one can cite as examples of how, howsoever, you know, totalitarian an idea of a state or a nation or a community or religion it might be, there are always responses and there are always resistances to totalitarian regimes from people, you know, and no totalitarian regime, howsoever totalitarian it may have been, we just have to study our history to know has really survived, and their ideas of the nation have survived in some senses. People have always reacted, people have always you know, answered back, and that is precisely what gives us hope, you know, even in the most difficult of times, even in the most difficult of periods of history that we may ourselves be a part of, you know. And so, you know, I mean, at times I do feel pessimistic, but I am essentially an optimist in heart, and I do believe that, you know, people eventually do win, you know, and people's power is really the real power in that sense, no matter what the ruling dispensation might have imagined for us. Right. So Anita's asking which is the most powerful women's movement in India. I don't think one can, you know, I mean, I don't think one can really have, you know, some sort of a, what should one say, a hierarchy of which women's movement is more important. You see, like, let's say, for example, for a community in Manipur, you know, the movement led by women in their own state would have been something which may have affected changes in their own society. And, you know, another movement, another part would not have made any difference to their own lives in some senses. So I don't think one, I mean, again, this whole idea of competitive, you know, or creating a hierarchy of, you know, the importance of women's movement, I don't think that's a very useful way of approaching the question, because, I mean, the idea, of course, was precisely to state that within communities, within their own societies, within their own locations, within their own spaces, within their own histories, women have engineered change. Women are continuing to engineer change, and those changes are most relevant for their own communities. Like, let's say, for example, it's a very hard task that Dawoodi Bohra Muslim women are leading, you know, against a certain kind of a religious imagination of what certain practices which are considered absolutely sacrosanct to their community are being questioned precisely by women, and they have such huge ramifications for the lives of women, you know, for the lives of little girls. So, you know, so for them, that is the most important thing, you know, whereas it may mean nothing to, you know, let's say those communities who do not undergo genital, you know, circumcision or mutilation in that sense. So I think there can be no competition in terms of which movement is more important. Each movement is as important as any other for the people that for whom that movement is, you know.
Simi, this is just a doubt. You know, though feminism is theorized and their rubrics are set by maybe the privileged women, maybe educated women, you know, the most of the examples that you cited and what we understand is these local movements, feminisms, are initiated by women at the margins. Do you think that? Do you think so? And what could be the possible reason?
Right, Johnson. I mean, yeah, it's a very important question, and that's why you see, like, I mean, like all of us in English departments, especially, are fed on, steady dose of what we consider feminism to be. And when we talk about feminism, we don't ever talk about women's movement. I mean, there might be, of course, we may pay lip service to suffragette movement, or we may talk about, voting rights, property rights, etc., etc. But quite quickly we jump onto Virginia Woolf and Simone de Beauvoir and Julia Kristeva and Nero's Alencizio. And I'm not saying that those writings are not important. They're very, very important and significant writings. But oftentimes we also forget, that there is actually a women's movement which also defines the paradigm of what feminism is, or what feminism must be, or what feminism should be. And that's why, as you would have seen, that I've not really named any theoretician. I could have named a lot of people from post-colonial feminism too, but I've shied away from that to be able to talk about actually women's movement rather than talk about, theoretical feminism, which would also be, is also a useful exercise. I'm not saying that that's not important, but you're absolutely right, which is, which speaks about, let's say, the spaces that we occupy in academia, which is, of course, a privileged space. We belong to privileged, castes and communities and class and, locations, etc., etc. And of course, we do therefore end up going by a particular narrative, which we receive, and which we also, I suppose, if we also circulate the same narrative, we also perpetrate in some senses. But the idea of today's lecture was precisely to be able to also make this humble point, which is that the responsibility also lies on us in terms of what we will mainframe, what we will mainstream, what we will think of is important in the narrative which we constitute for understanding of feminism in our own locations, in our own times, in some senses. And that's why I talked about, I'm hoping that some people will be interested in actually wanting to know about Mupilan, or wanting to know about, different movements, about the Dawoodi Bohra Muslim community, etc. But you're right, which is that these still exist on the margins of what we consider as mainstay feminism. There are still names which dominate when we talk about post-colonial feminism, and one can just talk about, the Spivaks and the, all the, and I'm not saying that their writings are not important, of course, but at the same time, I mean, the whole idea of bringing theory and practice together, or to talk about feminism, not just from a theoretical point of view, but also from the women's movement point of view, was precisely to fracture this discourse and to be able to actually bring together these discourses so that we can actually create a space for this diverse narrative, for narratives which are also there existing on the margins, which probably also need to be paid attention to. So yeah, but you're right, which is that, I mean, in the sense that there is a certain kind of a complicity we also as academics need to break away from.
Thank you.
I think there's one more question from Varsha here. Would you like to take that now?
Yeah. So Varsha asked, can you name any movement that outwardly seems like a proper post-colonial movement but has strong feminist roots too? I mean, I can cite many works in that direction. Like, let's say, for example, I'm not very sure if you're familiar with a post-colonial feminist called Chandra Talpade Mohanty, which is a fairly well-known post-colonial feminist who was, of course, based in India, and then she moved to the US, and she talks about feminist solidarities, etc., etc. And in the analysis that she does, I mean, I'm just giving you one example. Like, she does this analysis of the whale, and she studies a lot of feminists who have studied the whale, and she's tried to, in her analysis of the different feminist articulations on the whale, she's talked about that how, certain articulations belong to a certain kind of school, but there are certain other kind of articulations which are also more grassroots in nature, which take into account the realities of women themselves, and so they are rooted in women's movements. So there are all kinds of nuanced post-colonial feminists like Chandra Talpade Mohanty. So Feminism Without Borders, and I mean, of course, she moved to the US, but she's very, very conscious of talking about solidarity. So there are examples within post-colonial feminism itself who do talk about grassroots movements and do talk about these issues as well. So was India a matriarchal society in the long past? I mean, I mean, this is a very large question. I mean, in the sense that one has to go into the history of matriarchy and matrilineal. And of course, even within communities, you would see that even when one talks about matrilineal in societies like, let's say, for example, the Khasi society, within the Khasi society, you may have matrilineal. And of course, I'm not saying that there is there's not empowerment of women through matrimony. I mean, they carry the family name, they have huge role in terms of, how property gets passed on, etc., and all that. And yet the reality of a matrilineal society is that if you have representation of women in let's say, for example, or not just of Khasi women, but women at all in the legislative assembly, only have 2 or 3 members, and that this is the healthiest that they have been. Usually you would only have 1 woman. So how do you explain this dichotomy which actually exists, where you might actually have, as something which you present as a matrilineal society, but actually in practice, in terms of positions which are occupied in the public domain, like, let's say, for example, the legislative assembly, you would not have representation of women. So it's not a very easy question to address the question of matriarchy. Of course, one can always go back to all kinds of mythic pasts and histories, etc., but if you look at even here and now, and you look at the experience of matrilineal and I gave you the example of Khasi society, you would have matrilineal there, and of course that empowers women in very many ways, and yet you would, in public discourses, in public fora, in public institutions, not have women's representation, so which talks about a certain kind of a schism which kind of exists between, what may be considered a certain organization of social structures and, social structures as they exist in the public domain, which may still be fairly patriarchal, So.